Chapter 10: Grandfather's Last Trip. The people of both villages spent the next month storing the meat from the whale in large caches, built partially underground where it would stay permanently frozen. The mighty bowhead whale would supply them with enough meat to feed both settlements for the next winter. People from Gabel and Savunga often stopped by to visit with grandfather. They listened in rapt attention as he recounted the miracles of the Creator God. Mr. and Mrs. Campbell were busy teaching the village people about the Creator God. They rarely saw Rabat the shaman. He had left the village to move to the south side of the island to live in solitude and sort out his confused thinking about the Creator God and the spirits that he worshipped. Early one morning, as Yuki lay in bed, he heard grandfather talking to grandmother. I've decided to make one last trip to visit my friend Nathan. I want to go before the snow melts and travel becomes too difficult. The boy begged to go with him, but grandfather was firm. Not this time, he said. I will make this trip alone. The next morning, Yuki helped grandfather prepare the dogs and sled for the trip. When all was ready, grandfather knelt before Yuki and hugged him. The great Creator God has given me a precious gift in you, he said softly. Take good care of my wife. You're the man of the family now while I am gone. As Yuki stood watching the sled until it disappeared across the tundra, he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling deep within him that he was seeing his grandfather for the last time. Grandfather traveled south across the frozen lake and then guided the team east, up over the eastern mountain range south of the village. A cold, biting east wind blew in his face. The dogs seemed restless as they fought the wind. They traveled along the eastern slope of the mountain, then picked up a well-marked trail heading across the vast tundra. The sun was setting as grandfather stopped for a rest at the foot of the mountains west of Savunga. Here the trail split, one branch following the shore of ice while the other ascended the mountain slope. Grandfather built a small fire, and while sipping hot tea, he watched the cold eastern wind blowing the snow ahead in the mountain. The trail through the mountain would be hard to follow, he thought. Perhaps I should take the shore ice route. He stood for a few moments, observing the spirals of snow blowing off the ice ridges. Besides, he mused, this is the time when the polar bear comes to the islands on the ice floes. I would love to give a beautiful skin as a present to my friend Nathan. The icy east wind picked up sharply as grandfather swung his dog team onto the ice of the Bering Sea, fighting the stinging snow. He followed the trail that led close and closer to the edge of the shore ice. The dark, open water foamed in angry waves, splashing up on the ice. Grandfather knew this was a most dangerous time of the year to travel along the shore. Cracks opened in the unstable ice, then freezing again. They left a thin shell of ice that looked like the rest of the surface, but was not strong enough to support much weight. The dogs seemed increasingly nervous and agitated. Grandfather had seen them act this way before. There must be a polar bear close by, he thought, as he stopped the dog team. Walking carefully ahead of them, he checked the ground for tracks. Then, for a long moment, he stood quietly sniffing the air. He caught a faint sound. There was a bear close by. He could sense it. Quickly, he jumped back on the sled and urged the dogs forward. They were in a state of confusion and fear. Some attempted to turn around while others tried to obey grandfather's command. In a moment, They had gotten themselves hopelessly entangled in the traces. As he began untangling each dog along the line, he heard a deep growl behind him. In panic, the dogs leaped forward, knocking Grandfather off balance. The sled caught his foot and dragged him through the frigid water until the main trace connecting the sled to the dogs broke and the dog team ran off at full speed. The next morning, Yuki was eating his breakfast when he heard a commotion outside. His heart jumped to his throat as he ran outside to the dog lot. There stood Grandfather's dogs, whimpering helplessly, the traces and harnesses all tangled. Yuki ran back to the house. On the way, he met hunters preparing to go out for the day. Help! Help! He cried. Something has happened to Grandfather. The village quickly organized rescue teams, and a party of seasoned hunters began to search along the trail to Savunga. Yuki traveled with his father. From the sleds, he carefully watched the trail for Grandfather's sled tracks. But the strong wind, whipping the snow across the trail, had completely covered all sign of the sled's passage. As they traveled, Yuki silently prayed to the Creator God. Please keep Grandfather safe. You know how much I love him. The boy prayed. As the boy prayed, he sensed something deep within him that he had never experienced before. A feeling of peace seemed to lie close around his heart, as if the Creator God were standing right beside him with his arms around him. It reminded Yuki of the days when he was a young boy. He remembered sometimes at night when a nameless fear would come over him, and he would creep over to his mother's and father's sleeping place. As they snuggled him in between them, he had the same kind of nice feeling. Maybe that's what the Creator God is like, he thought. When the hunters came to the place where the trail split, Yuki and his father chose the trail through the mountain. We will meet in Savunga, his father told the other party. It was a cold night as they traveled through the mountains, facing the bitter Arctic wind. The stars shone pale on the frozen white snow as they searched the trail for any signs of Grandfather's sled. Yet they could see nothing except the drifting snow blown by the cold wind. Late the next morning, Yuki and his father's search party finally arrived in Savunga. They found no sign of the villagers or the search team that had traveled along the shore ice. But as they neared Nathan Nungwuk's house, they saw it surrounded by dog sleds. The men stepped quickly through the door, and as Yuki squeezed in behind his father, he saw what he had hoped never to see. Sprawled on the middle of the floor was the frozen body of Grandfather. The men were sitting around the lifeless body, rubbing it slowly, trying to warm it so it would lie straight. With a cry of anguish, Yuki ran to his grandfather. He knelt beside the frozen body and stroked the old man's cold face. The men sadly told their story to Yuki and his father. We found him sitting on his sled. His hands were clasped as though he was praying to his Creator God, and there was a look of peace on his face such as we have never seen. See, he still looks that way. Yuki studied his grandfather's face. Yes, the face was full of peace, and there seemed to be a little smile on the corners of his mouth. Somehow, it gave a little bit of comfort to Yuki's breaking heart. He knew his beloved grandfather had died trusting in his Creator God. It was a long, sad trip back to Gombo with grandfather's body carried on a sled. Grandfather's house was in the center of the village, and as the body lay in the main room, people came to pay their respects. Yuki stayed close and listened as the people talked about how grandfather had lived and told stories they remembered about him. The funeral took place on the third day after they returned. Yuki's father came in to get him. Come, walk with me, my son. I want to talk to you, he said quietly. After they passed through the village and along the shore, father spoke again. Yuki, you know the tradition of the people on the mountain, the burying place? All of our people are buried on the mountain. The elders and the hunters will make the decision where grandfather is to be buried. Yuki's father stopped and stared at the barren mountain as he continued. If a person is considered a fool, he will be buried at the foot of the mountain. If he was wise and a good man, respected by the people, he will be buried higher up the mountain. Only the honored and outstanding men are buried on top of the mountain. Your grandfather was a good man, highly respected, but because of his strange beliefs, the way he has gone against our traditional ways, the elders of the village will probably bury him close to the foot of the mountain. I just wanted you to know so that you would be prepared. Crushed by the thought of grandfather being regarded as a fool, Yuki suddenly wanted to run away and hide. Breaking away from his father, he raced to the dog lot, where he reached his dog Nansen. He dropped to his knees and buried his face in the ruff of fur on the animal's neck, and sobbed as though his heart would break. What father might happen, what father said might happen, would be the final insult. He had grown to love his grandfather deeply, and knew that such a burial would be an injustice to his memory. The funeral took place in the afternoon. The men placed grandfather's body in a simple box made of driftwood and put his favorite possessions in the box with him. Relatives carefully rested the coffin on his sled and attached long ropes to the front of the sled. Only hunters with special marks on parts of their body, such as knees and elbows, would be allowed to pull the sled. Slowly the procession made its way on foot to the foot of the mountain. Yuki watched from a distance. He couldn't stand the humiliation of knowing what was going to happen to his beloved grandfather. As the solemn procession reached the bottom of the mountain, the elders lifted the makeshift casket to their shoulders and began the trek up the face of the rugged slope. Not far from the foot of the steep incline, they set the casket down. Yuki choked back the tears and turned to go home, unable to watch any longer. But wait! The elders picked up the box and began to hike slowly upward. About halfway up the face of the mountain, they again laid the casket down to rest. Yuki edged to the front of the crowds of villagers and held his breath. Again the men picked up the load, and Yuki watched in astonishment as they labored further and further up toward the top. Finally they stopped and placed the casket at the highest point on the mountain. A murmur of approval rippled through the villagers crowded below. Yuki walked over to his father's side and slipped his hand into his. Looking up into his father's eyes, he saw tears streaming down the face. He knew how much his father loved grandfather. Father never one to show much emotion, but Yuki knew, deep inside, that father had been loved by a great man, just like he had been. Somehow, in spite of the pain, it felt good just to stand and hold father's hand.